Hey, everybody, it's Harrison. Welcome back to Maine Connects, your source for all things small business and real estate in Maine. We had today's guest on a little while back talking about the housing shortage in Maine and the fact that the state was commissioning a report to really understand where we're at. That report has come out, and as promised, we've brought Ryan Fecteau back onto the show to take us through that report and explain to us what the housing situation really is in Maine. So with that, welcome back, Ryan.
Great to be back. Always nice to chat with you about housing and what's going on here in Maine.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate the time. So, obviously you play a big role right now in housing in the state of Maine, working directly for the governor. So this report, I'm sure, is very close to you and something that was very important to you to come out. So as somebody who's been deeply involved in this process and in this report and understanding housing in Maine, let's get started. What are the major takeaways that this report has brought to us?
Well, the major takeaway is the fact that we need a little over 84,000 housing units by 2030. It's a pretty significant number of housing units, and it puts a target in front of us that should be motivating for both decision makers at the state and local level in terms of elected officials. But it should also be motivating for developers and the private sector to address the challenges that we face around housing. We obviously have a great deal of need, and we have a lot of housing to be built.
Yeah, so the report breaks down into a couple of categories. The first one being, what is our current need based on our historic underproduction? And then It really then moves into what do we need in terms of growth and support for growth? Because as we talked about before we went on, Maine's experienced population growth lately that's actually beyond the national average, which isn't normal for us. So let's start right at that historic underproduction. So can you talk us through, where are we at currently, and what is the historic underproduction issue that we've had?
Just for a visual for everyone, here's the report. It's rather thick, and certainly it takes a little bit of time to read through all of its guts and details. But it's easily the most comprehensive report we've ever had on housing in Maine history. It really gives a great deal of detail regarding the issues that we face and the challenges that we face, and it does so as you mentioned, Harrison, by providing us with a historic underproduction number. That number right now is 38,500 units of housing, and this number is a little bit different than what you might see in some other reports. The Low Income Housing Coalition national organization releases an annual estimate that has had Maine pegged around 20,000 for the last several years. That number is looking at specifically low-income subsidized housing, so it's not looking at the full market. This report is unique in the sense that it is looking at all housing types, regardless of who the consumer may be or who the owner or renter may be in terms of income brackets. It's really looking at the full scope of what our needs are. The other thing that's unique about this report is it's not just looking at underproduction from a standpoint of what we need right now to get back to a place of a healthy housing market. It's also factoring in the unfilled jobs that we have. So it's taking into account the number of jobs that are listed by employers across the state, and is accounting for those vacant jobs in producing a number that gets us to this 38,500 number. That's the historic underproduction plus the number of jobs that we need to fill right now here in the state of Maine, and the number of housing units we would need to compensate or to complement those job vacancies. So it's not only a housing report. In some ways, it's also a jobs report, because it's looking at what we need to do on the housing front to suffice or to meet the needs that employers have in terms of hiring. So it's sort of a double-edged sword in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that's important to understand because you have really two groups of people. You have one, the people that are already here looking for suitable housing, and that's one number.
Exactly.
But to your point, and I talk to business owners on an almost daily basis, there's also the people that we need to be living here to fill those jobs that we have and be able to run the coffee shops and other companies around the area. And we don't even know how many people those are necessarily because they're not here yet. We need to find a way to get them here. And obviously housing's the first piece to get somebody here, because if there's nowhere to live, there's no way for them to come.
Yeah. And we've of course have heard stories from employers across the state who have had difficulties with recruiting And then even in cases where they finally land a recruit to fill a vacant position, that person finds it difficult to find supportive, permanent housing. They might be living in a hotel while they try to find housing, and ultimately they get exhausted by the search and end up leaving the job. So we've heard of challenges from employers as large as BIW having difficulties with that. We've also heard from the public sector employers like towns and cities who have tried to hire employees and ultimately finding the same challenges on the housing front. In fact, the city of Rockland is a good example. They had a pretty public story several months ago of a search for a police chief. They offered the job to someone. He searched for housing for a number of months and ultimately had to withdraw from the role because he couldn't find housing in the Rockland area. So,
wow,
these are challenges that are hitting both public sector and private sector employers alike.
Yeah, and a big part of making Maine competitive economically is being able to bring that talent and those people into the state to work here. And if they've got nowhere to live, it's going to be really hard to attract and also really hard to retain, because I've heard that too, people moving out of state in some cases because they just can't make it work.
Exactly. And there are some unique challenges too. You know, this report includes numbers on job participation by age group. I think there's maybe a misconception out there that Maine's job participation rate is low. That's in part because when you look at the age breakdown, older adults, folks 65 and older, have moved out of the workforce at a rate that's been a little bit more, it's greater than it was before the pandemic. And so we saw this sort of acceleration in people leaving the workforce above the age of 65. And in fact, that number actually also includes people 55 and older. So if you look at the numbers for persons 55 and older, their job participation rate has dipped rather significantly since the pandemic. That's probably people who have decided to retire early. So they're leaving the workforce earlier than I think any of us could have anticipated, and that leaves job vacancies, which then adds to the constraints on our housing supply. So these are some unique challenges we face. It's important to note, though, on the other age groups, labor participation is very high. So Maine is actually either consistent with the national average or above the national average for job participation in those other age brackets, which I think sort of defeats a misconception people have that Maine has a low workforce participation rate amongst younger workers. It doesn't bear out in the numbers.
Yeah, and I constantly hear from people that there's more open jobs than there are applicants, and I think there's some people that just think that's something people say when it's hard to fill a job. But the reality of it is, what you're saying is the data is proving in most cases that's probably right.
Yeah, because they're either not finding candidates locally because there aren't people actually looking for jobs in the local market because they either have one or they've retired and they've left the workforce, or they're trying to recruit from out of state and attract people here. And again, as the examples I mentioned earlier, where employers have recruited from out of state, have successfully been able to relocate people here on a temporary basis, they find that they're still losing those employees because they can't find long-term housing.
All right, so we've got the historic underproduction component, which says we're about 38,500 units short of what we really need now.
Yeah.
And now the report gets into growth too. So let's talk a little bit about the growth. So this is population growth, economic growth. It's factoring in a lot of different forms of growth. But what is it looking as we look out and go forward? Yeah.
So we also take, and I should say that this report was produced by HR&A advisors. So they did all the nitty gritty work of pulling these numbers together, and they're the smart people behind this report. Certainly can't take credit for producing the numbers and pulling all the data and doing all that analysis. But what they did in this report is they also looked at a projection outwards to 2030. And the way they produced their 2030 projection was, again, leveraging or relying upon projected or expected job vacancies and employer needs. The outward projection takes into account population growth, which we expect to be around 3%, and then the expected job vacancies that will occur, again, in part because of retirements and so forth. And that number lands us, I think, around 42,000, if I remember correctly, although I'd have to reference back to the report real quickly. And that's where when we take the underproduction number and we add it to this projected growth number and future need, we get to the 80,000 plus units needed by 2030. So the future need is 45,800, and that's if we're being more liberal with the number, and on the conservative end, the future need would be 37,900. So somewhere between 38,000 and 46,000 units of housing needed by 2030, on top of the underproduction and the current needs that we have in the job sector in the employer sector. So those two numbers combined gets us to that 80,000 plus unit number, and that's a tall order. We have a lot of work to do. I think there's been reports that said we need to double the number of housing permits that we've been issuing on an annual basis statewide, where we need to be. I think the last time we were producing housing at the rate that this report indicates we would need is in the 1980s. So we need sort of a 1980s style housing revolution to occur here in the state of Maine to realize these goals.
Yeah, and as we talked about last time, this obviously, you can't go to one county or one town and say, hey, we need you to fill this hole. It's going to take an effort from every town and every developer and everybody to come together and take this down piece by piece. But I have to ask, when this report came out, what was the initial reaction to that number and seeing where we're at?
Well, I think folks may be a little overwhelmed. I realize that's a pretty natural reaction to a report with such significant numbers. But I think the real beauty of this report is it gives us something tangible to aspire to, which we really didn't have before. And it also breaks it down regionally. So we can see ourselves in this report. We can see our county or our region of the state in this report. And I think that provides local decision makers with a tool in order to make better decisions around housing. And I hope it's motivating, and I think it is motivating to have these numbers and then be able to say, look, we have huge needs statewide to address not only the housing shortage as it exists today, but to make sure we're prepared for the future, and so that we can have an economy that is flourishing and employers who can find employees who are not only skilled and meet the job description, but it can also be housed safely and affordably in a place close to work, hopefully, so they don't have long commutes.
Yep.
I think this is the beauty of the report. It gives people, and it gives decision makers a tool that they can use when making really important decisions around how do we address the housing shortage that exists. And I think this report is in many ways a roadmap to these conversations, because as you know, we still have a lot of work to do to change local approval processes, some of the barriers that exist to housing in terms of the approval process. And so this hopefully will be sort of the light bulb moment for some communities that maybe have been thinking about what they might do around housing, or how do you make it easier or less complicated to build. Maybe this will be the tool they need to see that work forward. And then, of course, the public investment that will continue to be needed. Obviously, the governor has done a great job prioritizing housing. We've put $285 million forward this governor and the legislature since she took office in 2019. Prior to her coming to office in this century, we had put $65 million towards housing. So you can see over $200 million more than we had invested in the last 19 years. So pretty significant increase in that investment, but we still have a lot more work to do.
It's good to see the activity this has gotten and the attention that's gotten. And I saw a news headline say about a project in Westbrook coming out 186 units, and we're seeing more and more of those pop up about 80 units here, 100 there. So I feel like there's a lot of momentum here. But sitting where you're sitting, where do we go from here? The state has made a lot of investments. We've got LD 2003 that's hopefully now fully rolling out in most communities. When you kind of survey the scene, where do we go from here? What are those next steps?
Well, I think one thing that we can hopefully now accomplish, which was part of LD 2003, setting goals in terms of housing production. This report tells us what the deficit is, what our underproduction is at the moment, what we need to try to address, and now we have to set out on setting goals. Hopefully aspirational and some realistic goals. So goals nonetheless, in order to sort of set the benchmark that we're aspiring to accomplish. I think that's one task that's before us, and then I think it's still thinking outside the box around how we build more housing more efficiently and more affordably. And there are some really good ideas out there. I actually was just staffing a stakeholder group that was looking at accessory dwelling units and how we make financing, how we reduce some financial barriers that exist for homeowners who want to build an ADU, and then also this concept of pre-approved accessory dwelling units, where there might be a catalog that a municipality maintains, where someone can sort of pull a pre-approved design off the shelf, and they're 10 steps ahead of in the process than they would otherwise be if they were building it from scratch or without a plan that's been pre-approved by the community. And that concept can be replicated not just for an accessory dwelling unit, but perhaps for infill development. You can see this being used as for a duplex, maybe a double decker or a triple decker multifamily unit. There are a lot of creative ways, and we've seen some really creative uses of the pre-approval process in other communities. In fact, we had a presentation from a guy who runs a company that's been helping communities design pre-approved programs. Bryan, Texas was one example he used, where the community has this really beloved home that everyone loves. It's older home, was built in the early 1900s, and they created a series of pre-approved designs, not just for ADUs, but for duplexes and a few other types of buildings. And it was all based on that beloved home that everyone in the community loves. So they took some of the characteristics of that house and carried it out through their pre-approved designs. And that got people on board with allowing these other building types to be added for infill development and so forth. Another example he used was this concept of courtyard subdivisions, where the town pre-approved a series of lots throughout the community with, I think it had 2 duplexes and then a single family home sort of in the center, all in a single lot. And they call that a subdivision courtyard. This community was willing to allow a subdivision courtyard because they knew that what the designs were going to look like. They had basically applied the allowance based on the pre-approved design. So it took the risk out of it for the community. They were willing to take that step to do something new because they de-risked by pre-approving the design that they liked. And I thought that was a really creative approach to maybe doing things that communities wouldn't otherwise allow because they're fearful if they create the broad allowance that they'll get a series of different kinds of designs and configurations. And in this case, they had a little bit more control. So there's a lot of really, I think, good ideas that still remain. LD 2003 was obviously a big step in terms of reforming zoning and land use codes, but we still have a lot of flexibility. We have a lot more we could do, and communities, local jurisdictions are going to be leading the way. And I'm excited to see how they take this report and see the numbers for their county or for their region and think, we need to take some action in order to realize the production that's needed by 2030. And I think we'll see some communities do some really cool, unique, and aspirational and innovative things in order to boost housing supply.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point too, is these towns are really challenged with needing to bring more housing to the market. So the idea of pre-approved is great because that way they know that it's going to fit what they're looking for. But there's also that they're also charged with kind of protecting what makes each of our communities so unique and keeps Maine Maine.
Exactly.
We don't want to turn into Boston. We don't want to turn into a major metropolitan, but because that's not the allure of Maine. But obviously we have to grow. We have to adapt with the times. We have to make Maine more competitive. So there's definitely some growing pains that are going to happen here. There's definitely some stretching beyond maybe the normal for us that's going to have to happen here. And I love the fact that we're open to thinking about other things like pre-approved designs, ADUs. Last time we were on, we talked about tiny homes and modulars and maybe stuff that's not built on site. Given what we've learned
Exactly.
now, I'm sure all those things are becoming even more important than we thought they were.
Yeah, I got to tour the first bio-based 3D printed home at Maine Orono last week that was designed there and built there. And obviously, there's still some more work to be done to get that type of housing to be built at scale. But it was very impressive, and I think provides a glimpse into some of the solutions that might be part of the future of housing in Maine and beyond. I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing nationwide as well. I was just at a conference in DC, and we heard from there was a keynote from the governor of Montana, and just underscores the bipartisan urgency to address the housing challenges we face. Montana did a lot of the same things we just did with LG 2003, and their motivation was they didn't want to become California, and they wanted to maintain density where density already exists and not have sprawl into the beautiful open spaces and rural agricultural community parts of the state across Montana. That's the same goals we have here in Maine. We want to maintain density where density already exists, making sure that we can build housing in places where housing is nearby and already exists, near services, and making sure we don't instigate sprawl into the areas of our state that we value because of the recreational opportunities and agricultural opportunities and other opportunities those spaces present to us, and the reasons, as you said, why we love Maine to begin with. But in order to make sure that that's not the case, we need to be innovative and think about how we use infill development, existing lots, allowing for people who have single family homes to add additional units on their lots. We have to break up the way we had thought about housing for the last 100 years, which was really, single family subdivisions for the most part. Obviously still have a place because home ownership has an important place in this conversation as well. But we need to make sure that we're not just fixated on single family housing development, because it's not going to be nearly enough on a per parcel basis to impact the kind of numbers we need to realize in this report. So we need a combination of home ownership, single family, and multifamily, which may just be a duplex, which is in my opinion not a terribly threatening kind of design, and creates opportunities for someone who builds a duplex to have a second income, offsetting the cost of construction or a mortgage or whatnot. Having creative solutions to these problems that have really existed for a long time. In fact, one thing I heard at that conference was if triple deckers had been allowed, like they were back in the 70s or 60s, I think is when we sort of moved our ordinances away from allowing triple deckers. If we had allowed them to continue to be built in New England at the same clip they were being built prior to 1970, we would not have a housing crisis.
Wow.
If we were on the same rate trajectory as we were back in the 1970s, we would not have a housing crisis because triple deckers had provided the housing supply we needed to keep up with demand. We've largely, in most communities, prohibited triple deckers from being built. And again, these are things that communities can start thinking about. Is it consistent with our community where we already have triple deckers that were approved many decades ago to reallow them again? These are things that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, it definitely completely changes the paradigm for Maine. It completely changes how we have to think about housing, how we think about density, how we think about planning. Because you're right, for many years it was everybody wanted the single family home on the nice lot in a subdivision just outside downtown, so they could get to things easily but have some space. And to your point, it's really hard to get to 84,000 units one at a time. But if you can mix in some twos and threes along the way, you pick up some momentum and speed and get there a lot faster. So it's definitely interesting to see how we're going to have to adjust what we do to make sure that we can get to where we need to get to and keep Maine competitive.
Yeah, exactly. And one important point that this report spoke to is the fact that we need a vacancy rate of around 5%. That's part of the numbers that we have here. So it's not just how do we make sure every person who needs a home has one. It's also about having a healthy vacancy rate, which most practitioners will settle on the number 5%. That is the vacancy rate you want in the housing market. Right now, we're at 2.3%. So we have a pretty unhealthy housing market on the vacancy side, and that's contributing to the affordability crisis we have and the availability crisis that we have. And so getting to that 5% is going to be really important as well. So building enough housing, not only to meet the needs that exist, human to human, but also making sure we have that vacancy that allows for people to have the mobility to move from a home ownership to a rental, or rental to a home ownership, or have that rental that you stay in while you're looking for home ownership. Maybe you're between a larger home to downsizing into a smaller home. Right now these options really don't exist for people, and so they're fearful to list their home on the market because they're not sure where they're going to go.
And it's entirely true. I talk to people on a daily basis that are, they'd like to move. They maybe aren't in the best situation for them, but that's where it comes back to. There's no inventory to buy. And to your point, it's not even so much about having enough housing just for the people looking, but you have to have so much inventory kind of always out there to allow people the confidence. A lot of moving is confidence. It's confidence in the ability to move. It's confidence in where you're going. It's confidence that you're going to find safe housing and the amenities you want wherever you're going. It's not even so much necessarily about the house, but we have such an affordability issue right now because there are so many people chasing the same few number of housing units, whether they're rentals or homes to own. And what it does is just, it further exacerbates our affordability problem because people just don't feel confident they can move. They don't feel confident that they're going to be in a equivalent position if they were to make that move. And that really is what's making this market so difficult. And I hear clients all the time say, well, I'm going to wait until the market cools down and comes down. It's, based on this report, I don't suspect that to happen anytime soon. This is where we're going to be for a while. And we have to do the best we can to adjust and learn to operate within it.
Yeah, exactly. They might mean sellers putting contingencies on the sale that they have to find housing before the sale goes through, and people being aware that those options exist is another important thing. That knowing that you aren't confined to a sale and then being out on the street. You can put that contingency in place if it makes sense for the buyer and seller. So there are things that exist, but I think the constraints, the pressures still will be there, and it will definitely make it challenging. And another layer of complexity is, not only do you need a healthy vacancy rate of 5%, but you want to make sure that people are going to want to look for housing options that are near where they're working. And that's another layer of complexity here is, making sure we have the housing in the places where it's most needed, and that being near employers. We have a lot of Mainers who are traveling really far to get to work, to and from work every single day, and that's also not sustainable. And when people start to think about traffic patterns and their concerns about housing development and traffic, one thing that I think is often lost in the conversation is it's not just about traffic as it exists in your own community. It's about traffic as it exists in the larger picture of someone having to go from 30, 40 miles every day to work, and what that causes to 295 that now feels like a highway in Massachusetts outside of Boston versus the highway we've known it to be, growing up, where it was never really congested. Now you hit the 5 o'clock, departure from work to home on 295, and you really feel it's a different feeling.
Yep.
It's a little bit more congested than it once was, and that's because people can't find housing near their employers in the greater Portland area. So these are challenges that exist in a big way, and we have to take into account how our resistance to housing in our communities is resulting in these pain points that are sometimes used as arguments against housing.
And that's the one thing I can really appreciate, and I'm thankful for the state for this initiative and spending the time to go and do this, is that we at least now know the problem. We've quantified the issue. We know what we're up against. We're not guessing or estimating. We really know where we've got to get to. So step one is you need to know the problem before you can really go and address the problem. So now we know the issue, we've quantified the issue, and now we can go and get to work. And because ultimately, like you've been saying, this is going to require everybody to work together. It's going to require public and private cooperation and collaboration. It's going to require some innovation. It's going to require that we maybe change our thinking a little bit about housing and what we're used to, what we're comfortable with. But ultimately, at least now we know what we're up against and can begin to work towards solving this problem.
Yeah, exactly. You hit it right on the nail on the head. We need to know where we're going in order to get there, and this report gives us a better sense of where that destination is going to be. And it's a much longer road than maybe some of us anticipated,
Yep.
but at least we've laid down the pavement to get there.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. So
we have to have in part a willingness to put gas in the car now and all that stuff. But I think we or charge the car, whatever,
yeah,
whichever kind of vehicle you have, electric or otherwise. But we have to be able to power the vehicle. We have to be able to put our foot on the gas. The analogy now takes us to the point of sort of implementation and how much are we going to be willing to invest and change how we've approached housing in the past, which is unfortunately too often with resistance, and we're seeing some of that resistance in communities right now. Not too far from us, Harrison, over in Saco,
yep.
With a project proposed there. We've seen the news stories about Gorham and the opposition to a housing project there. This report puts those conversations in context a little bit more than they may have otherwise been. And so when I see numbers like 300 plus housing units, and I see the opposition to them, I'm a little bit more weary now than maybe I was otherwise, because we have a lot of work to do, and 300 plus units is a substantial dent in the needs that we face. So community leaders need to think about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's why I am so appreciative of the effort that's been put into this and the work you've been doing, especially to, continue to make this issue known and be able to quantify it and begin to put together, pragmatic solutions and options to go and attack this. So, so before we wrap up and I'll let you go, Ryan, any final thoughts for you on this report and the state of housing in Maine?
The only other thing that I found fascinating, because I'm pretty good at paying attention to statistics around housing, and thought I had all the good ones in the back of my mind, but this one really stood out to me regarding the median sale price of a home in Maine. As of July 2023, the median sales price in the state was $387,400, which was a 9% increase from the year prior. What I didn't know, I'd seen that number, so I had a good understanding of that. But what I did not know was that number is a 63% increase from July 2019. So in a very compressed timeline, we have seen a significant increase in the median sale home price, 63%. I don't know what that looks like state by state, but I am willing to guess we are up there at the higher end of that percentage nationwide. And that really sort of, for me, underscores the challenge we face in this housing market. It's becoming more unattainable for people, and that's not what we should be aspiring to. We should be finding ways to make it more obtainable for anyone and everyone who wants to experience the benefits of home ownership, which obviously has a huge tie-in with building equity and building wealth. And you can't build wealth if you can't obtain the home at the median sale price that it is today. And that is, for me, the motivator behind the work I do in the governor's office, and the reason why I find the issue of housing to be the number one issue we face here in the state of Maine.
Yep. No, it's a great point. And, the housing creates a little over $4 trillion a year in activity across the country, because buying a home, you go out and you decorate and you buy things for it. And, when you're obviously building homes, that creates jobs and material purchases. And, housing itself is such a massive engine to our overall economy across the country, especially here in Maine, where we're not necessarily we're not Silicon Valley. We are a trades-based, more blue-collar type environment. When people aren't moving and improvements aren't being made and houses aren't being built, it's a massive drag on the economy. So the healthier our housing market is and the more fluid it is, the better the state does overall in all aspects.
Agreed. That's exactly the takeaway. And we have to recognize housing as sort of foundational, without the pun intended, as foundational to everything else that we expect and hope for our state's success and our prosperity. We cannot realize prosperity for Maine families without having access to affordable, attainable, and available housing. And right now, we're a little bit on shaky ground in regards to those things.
Yep, 100%. Couldn't agree more. So, well, with that, Ryan, I really appreciate the time. I appreciate everything you're doing, trying to drive this issue and make some progress. Look forward to connecting with you again here in the future. I'd love to continue to update, let people know what's going on, because I do think, as you mentioned, housing is so foundational. It's so critical in this state. It's a topic I hear everywhere. So the more we can raise awareness and share what's going on, I think the more people will feel better about the direction we're heading.
Totally agree. And people can find this report at maine.gov/future. So that's maine.gov/future. And then there's a housing tab. You click on that and you can go find the full report. Or if you're more interested in the abbreviated version, there's a nice 13-page executive summary on there as well.
Really appreciate it, Ryan. Appreciate the update. Appreciate what you're doing. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Harrison. Appreciate it.